What if the songs you heard in church weren't just prayers set to music but secret maps guiding travelers through dangerous lands? Picture this, a medieval choir raising their voices in harmony, their hymns weaving more than just sacred verses. Hidden within those melodies were detailed routes, landmarks, and safe passages, carefully encoded to help messengers, merchants, and even spies navigate war-torn regions without drawing suspicion. This wasn't just artistry, it was survival. In an era where maps were rare, heavily guarded, and often stolen, the humble choir book became an unlikely vessel for cartography, disguised as something too ordinary to scrutinize. The idea sounds like something from a spy novel, but history is full of ingenious solutions to impossible problems. During the Middle Ages, borders shifted like sand, and crossing from one territory to another could mean life or death. Roads were watched, scrolls were searched, and carrying a map outright was a risk few could afford. So how did people share vital directions without alerting the wrong eyes? They turned to the one place where ink and parchment moved freely, the church. Choir hymns, with their intricate notations and seemingly innocent lyrics, became the perfect hiding place. A curve in the musical staff might trace a river bend. A cluster of notes could mark a hidden ford. To the untrained ear, it was divine music. To those in the know, it was a lifeline. This is the story of how faith and geography intertwined in the most unexpected way. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel the methods used to embed these maps, the brave individuals who relied on them, and the startling precision hidden within what seemed like simple songs. You'll discover how a single hymn book could hold the key to crossing hostile territories, and why these musical maps were far more than just clever tricks. They were acts of quiet rebellion, preserving knowledge and connection in a fractured world. So lean in close, because by the end of this journey, you'll never listen to medieval music the same way again. The past is whispering its secrets, and the melody is just the beginning. The Crusades were a time of chaos and desperation, where travelers faced constant danger from bandits, rival armies, and shifting borders. But amid this turmoil, an ingenious solution emerged from an unexpected place: the quiet scriptoriums of medieval monasteries. These sacred spaces, already bustling with scribes copying religious texts, became secret workshops for crafting hidden maps. Monks, with their deep knowledge of music and geography, found a brilliant way to merge the two. By weaving landmarks and routes into the very fabric of choir hymns, they created guides that could pass unnoticed under the noses of even the most suspicious guards. The process started with careful collaboration between scribes and musicians. A scribe might take a traditional map showing rivers, mountain passes, or safe villages, and translate its lines into musical notation. A sharp bend in a river could become a sudden leap in pitch. A cluster of trees might be represented by a series of quick, staccato notes. The lyrics, too, played a role. A verse about crossing the Jordan could subtly reference a real river crossing used by messengers. To the untrained ear, it sounded like pious devotion. But to those who knew the code, it was a step-by-step path to safety. What made this system so effective was its simplicity. Unlike complex ciphers requiring keys or special training, these musical maps relied on patterns that were easy to recognize once you knew what to look for. A monk traveling between monasteries could hum a hymn and mentally trace the journey without ever pulling out a suspicious parchment. Even if someone intercepted a choir book, they'd see only sacred music, not the life-saving directions hidden in plain sight. This wasn't just clever, it was a testament to how medieval scholars turned art into a tool for survival. The real genius lay in how adaptable these maps were. A single hymn could be slightly altered to reflect new routes or dangers, allowing the knowledge to stay current without raising alarms. And because hymns were copied and shared across regions, the system spread quietly, creating a hidden network of guidance stretching across Europe and beyond. It was a silent rebellion against the violence of the age, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapons weren't swords or shields, but ink, parchment, and a carefully placed note. To the unsuspecting observer, a medieval choir book would appear as nothing more than a collection of sacred songs, neat rows of notes climbing the staff, ornate initials blooming at the edges of the page. But for those who knew how to look, these manuscripts held an entirely different kind of treasure. Scribes became masters of visual deception, turning every element of musical notation into a potential hiding place. The curve of a single note might mirror the bend of a hidden trail, while the spacing between two syllables could indicate the distance between safe houses. Even the color of the ink played a role. A slightly darker shade might mark a treacherous stretch of road, or a faint red dot could signal a place to rest. Some of the most ingenious hiding spots were right in plain sight. Take the decorative initials that began each hymn, those elaborate letters swirling with vines and animals. A skilled scribe could tuck an entire mountain range into the flourish of a capital, D, or use the loops of a G to trace the outline of a coastline. Marginalia, those whimsical doodles in the page borders, often served double duty. A tiny drawing of a fox might seem like a monk's idle sketch, but it could actually point to a forest path where scouts had spotted enemy patrols. The beauty of these techniques was their subtlety. They relied on elements so ordinary that only someone specifically trained would notice their true purpose. Auditory clues were just as cunning. A sudden shift from a smooth, flowing melody to a series of sharp, staccato notes might warn of rocky terrain ahead. A repeated sequence could indicate a place where travelers needed to double back to find a hidden ford. Even the rhythm held meaning. A slow, deliberate tempo might mirror the cautious pace needed to cross a marsh, while a quick, lively section could signal an open road safe for swift travel. The genius was in the layers to most listeners. It was simply beautiful music, but to those initiated into the system, every note was a breadcrumb leading the way. One of the most striking examples comes from a 12th century hymn book discovered in a monastery near the French-German border. At first glance, the page shows a typical hymn praising Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers, a fitting choice for a hidden map. But look closer, and the notes form a near-perfect match for the local geography. The rising and falling melody traces the path of a river used by merchants to bypass toll roads, while a cluster of oddly placed dots in the margin aligns with a series of caves that offered shelter from bandits. The hymn's lyrics, too, hold hidden meaning. A line about walking through the valley of shadows refers to a narrow pass where ambushes were common, urging travelers to move quickly and quietly. It's a masterpiece of dual-purpose design, proving that these weren't just random symbols but carefully crafted tools for survival. What's remarkable is how these techniques varied by region. In mountainous areas, scribes might emphasize sharp pitch changes to mirror steep climbs, while coastal communities used undulating melodies to mimic the tides. Some monasteries even developed their own signature styles, a way to ensure that only trusted allies could decode their maps. This wasn't just about hiding information. It was about creating a language flexible enough to adapt to whatever dangers the road might hold. And that adaptability made all the difference when a single wrong turn could mean capture or worse. The true brilliance of these hidden maps wasn't just in their execution, but in their universality. A traveler from Italy could follow a hymn composed in England because the language of music and symbols crossed borders in ways spoken words could not. In a world fractured by war and suspicion, these melodies became a silent thread connecting the faithful, the desperate, and the determined, all while sounding like nothing more than devotion set to song. Among the most striking examples of these musical maps is the hymn of St. Gregory's Pass, a 12th century melody that once guided travelers through one of the deadliest crossings in the Alps. At first listen, the hymn sounds like a solemn tribute to the saint, its slow, measured cadence evoking reverence. But to those who knew its secrets, every note was a carefully plotted step through jagged cliffs, icy slopes, and hidden crevices. The manuscript, rediscovered in a Swiss monastery in the 19th century, reveals just how ingenious these hidden maps could be. Scholars studying the parchment noticed something peculiar. The spacing between certain notes matched the actual distances between landmarks along the pass. A sustained high note coincided with a narrow ledge where travelers needed to hug the cliffside, while a sudden drop in pitch warned of a steep descent ahead. What makes this hymn so remarkable is its precision. The scribes who crafted it didn't just approximate the terrain, they replicated it. By overlaying the musical notation with a map of the pass, researchers found near-perfect alignment. The hymn's melody traced the path's twists and turns so accurately that modern hikers could theoretically follow it even today. But the real brilliance lay in its adaptability. The same hymn could be subtly altered to reflect seasonal changes, a verse added to mark a summer landslide, or a note shifted to indicate a winter avalanche zone. This wasn't a static map, it was a living document, updated by monks who likely received first-hand reports from brave souls who'd survived the journey. The story of its rediscovery reads like a detective novel. A musicologist in the 1800s, poring over the monastery's archives, noticed odd annotations in the margins, tiny symbols resembling rock formations. Intrigued, he compared the manuscript to descriptions of the pass in old travel logs. The closer he looked, the more the pieces fit. A cluster of quick, sharp notes matched a section known for falling rocks, while a long, descending scale mirrored a switchback trail still used by shepherds. Even the lyrics held hidden meaning. A line about the saint's guiding hand referred to a distinctive rock shaped like an outstretched arm, a natural landmark travelers used to orient themselves. But this hymn wasn't just a navigational tool, it was a lifeline. The pass it mapped was notorious for claiming lives, especially in winter when blizzards could erase all traces of the path. Merchants carrying wool, salt, and spices relied on these coded melodies to avoid becoming another grim statistic. Some historians believe the hymn was even sung aloud during storms, its rhythm helping groups stay together when visibility dropped to zero. Imagine the scene, a line of figures huddled against the wind, voices rising in unison, not just in prayer but in survival. Each note was a beacon, each verse a rope thrown across the abyss. The hymn of St. Gregory's Pass also hints at a wider network of musical maps. Similar manuscripts have surfaced across Europe, some guiding pilgrims to Rome, others helping diplomats navigate war-torn borderlands. What ties them together is their shared language of symbols and sounds, a kind of cartographic Morse code woven into sacred music. This wasn't the work of a lone genius but a collective act of defiance, a way to outwit kings, bandits, and nature itself using nothing but ink and ingenuity. And perhaps that's the most astonishing part. In an age where knowledge was power, these hymns let ordinary people carry entire landscapes in their minds, hidden in plain sight beneath the cloak of faith. Monasteries during the Middle Ages were far more than quiet retreats for prayer. They were bustling hubs of knowledge where geography and faith intertwined in extraordinary ways. While scribes meticulously copied religious texts, they also gathered something far more perilous: the precise details of distant roads, rivers, and mountain passes. Pilgrims arriving from Jerusalem, merchants fresh from Silk Road journeys, and even soldiers returning from crusades would share their travels in hushed conversations. These first-hand accounts became the raw material for an underground cartographic trade, hidden in plain sight within the very hymns sung in chapel. The system relied on the monastery's unique position as a crossroads of information. Unlike royal courts or military outposts, these sacred spaces welcomed travelers from all walks of life, making them ideal listening posts. A monk in Burgundy might learn of a new bandit ambush near Milan from a wool merchant, while a scribe in Canterbury could update a coastal route based on a sailor's warning. This constant flow of intelligence transformed monasteries into living archives where maps weren't just drawn, they were whispered, debated, and refined. But how did these secrets travel safely across borders? Here, the monastic network itself became the delivery system. Monks frequently moved between sister institutions, carrying books as gifts or for copying. A choir book sent from a French abbey to one in Germany might appear to be a simple act of devotion, but tucked between its psalms were vital updates to routes and hazards. Some monasteries even developed rotating schedules, ensuring that no single courier carried too much knowledge at once. It was a delicate dance of trust and discretion, where a single slip could unravel the entire web. The risks were staggering. In an era where knowledge was power, controlling trade routes and military passages meant the difference between wealth and ruin. Authorities who suspected a monastery of harboring these hidden maps could respond with brutal force, raiding scriptoriums, imprisoning scribes, or worse. Yet the monks persisted, often encoding their work with layers of misdirection. A particularly suspicious-looking hymn book might be left conspicuously on a shelf, while the real guide was tucked into a less obvious volume, like a mundane agricultural manual. Some even employed decoys, creating false trails in case of interrogation. What's often overlooked is how these efforts went beyond mere survival tactics. By preserving and sharing geographic knowledge, monasteries became accidental guardians of connectivity in a fractured world. When wars shattered trade alliances or floods washed out roads, their hidden maps kept lines of communication open. A merchant in Venice might rely on a hymn from a Spanish monastery to navigate newly unstable territories, while a diplomat could use a borrowed choir book to find safe passage through rival lands. This wasn't just about secrecy, it was about sustaining a fragile web of movement and exchange against all odds. The legacy of these monastic cartographers lingers in surprising ways. Modern researchers have found that some of the routes hidden in hymns align almost perfectly with ancient Roman roads, suggesting monks preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to time. Other melodies contain subtle warnings, like avoiding a valley prone to landslides, that still hold true centuries later. Perhaps the most poignant detail is how often these maps emphasized not just efficiency but safety. A hymn might direct travelers past a hermit's cave where shelter could be found, or note which villages would offer aid to the wounded. In an age of chaos, these were maps drawn with compassion as much as cunning. Yet for all their ingenuity, the system depended on something far more vulnerable than parchment: human trust. A scribe had to believe the merchant's tale of a new shortcut. A traveling monk had to resist bribes or threats, and every person who memorized a melody's hidden path had to choose whether to share it or hoard it. That fragile chain of cooperation, stretching across languages and loyalties, might be the most remarkable map of all. Carrying a choir book could be a death sentence in the wrong hands. Across medieval Europe, rulers and warlords knew the power of controlling movement. and they hunted anyone caught smuggling hidden maps with terrifying efficiency. In the Holy Roman Empire, a minstrel caught with a suspicious hymn book might have his tongue cut out to prevent him from singing its secrets. In France, a group of monks was burned at the stake after authorities discovered their psalter contained coded directions to English-held territories. The punishment wasn't just about cruelty, it was a warning. These musical maps threatened the very foundations of power, letting people slip through borders like shadows. Yet the risks only made the system more ingenious. Take the story of Brother Mathias, a scribe from a Rhineland monastery who became legendary among travelers. Disguised as a wandering musician, he carried choir books strapped beneath his robe, their maps updated with fresh intelligence from refugees. His most daring act came during a siege, when he smuggled out a hymn detailing an underground river route hidden in the decorative vines of a capital letter. For weeks, the melody spread from village to village, allowing civilians to escape the encircling army. When Mathias was finally captured, the local lord ordered him to reveal how the escapes had happened. According to chroniclers, the old monk simply smiled and began singing. Minstrels played an equally vital role, their status as entertainers giving them unusual freedom to cross borders. A troubadour might perform a seemingly innocent love ballad at a noble's feast, only for spies in the crowd to note how certain phrases matched the turns of a smuggler's path. Some developed elaborate tricks like the Italian singer who encoded Alpine passes into lullabies, knowing children would memorize them effortlessly. Others used instruments as cues. A sudden shift from lute to flute could signal listeners to pay attention to the next verse's hidden meaning. The most heartbreaking stories often involve ordinary people thrust into danger. A merchant's wife in Burgundy was said to have sewn a hymn's musical notation into her embroidery, each stitch marking a safe house along the Loire Valley. When soldiers ransacked her home, they found nothing. She'd unraveled the thread and swallowed it. In Wales, a blind harpist memorized over 24 route-bearing melodies, becoming a living atlas for rebels evading Norman castles. His survival depended on never writing anything down and trusting that those who learned the tunes would guard them as fiercely as he did. What's striking is how these maps evolved under pressure. In regions where authorities grew suspicious of choir books, scribes switched to even subtler methods. Some used the spacing between words to indicate distances, while others embedded clues in the saints' feast days listed in liturgical calendars. A mention of Saint Christopher on July 25th might hint at a river crossing near a chapel dedicated to him. The constant cat and mouse game forced cartographers to think like artists, spies, and poets all at once. The true cost of this secrecy echoes in the gaps of history. For every Mathias or harpist remembered in chronicles, countless others vanished without record, caught carrying a suspicious parchment, or betrayed by someone who valued coin over compassion. Yet their legacy lives on in the routes that endured long after the wars ended. Many of Europe's oldest pilgrimage paths still follow the twists and turns first mapped in those forbidden hymns, a silent tribute to those who risked everything to keep the way open. Decoding these maps required more than just musical skill. It demanded a shared language of trust. A traveler arriving at a monastery wouldn't simply ask for directions. They'd hum a specific phrase from a hymn, waiting to see if the porter's response held the right counter-melody. Some communities used seasonal cues. A verse about spring planting might contain different clues in autumn, when harvests changed the landscape. The system's brilliance lay in its fluidity, allowing updates to spread through something as simple as a new choir boy learning a slightly altered tune. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in what these maps carried beyond geography. Between the notes, scribes often tucked warnings about which lords demanded bribes, which bridges could bear a loaded cart, even which innkeepers could be trusted with secrets. These weren't just directions, they were guidebooks for humanity, reminding travelers that survival depended on both the path and the people along it. And that may be why authorities feared them so much. In a world built on walls and weapons, a song that taught strangers how to help one another was truly revolutionary. Learning to read these hidden maps was like mastering a secret language, one where every dot, line, and curve held meaning beyond the music. The cipher systems varied from monastery to monastery, but they all shared a common goal: to be unmistakably clear to initiates while remaining invisible to outsiders. Some scribes used the color of ink as code. A note written in faint red might mark a dangerous river crossing, while a deep blue could indicate a safe village with friendly innkeepers. Others relied on the shape of the notes themselves. A square neum, rare in standard notation, might signal a sharp turn in the path, while a diamond-shaped one could point to a hidden spring just off the trail. Rhythm was another powerful tool. A sudden shift from a flowing, even tempo to a syncopated beat might warn of an area where travelers needed to move unpredictably to avoid patrols. In one surviving manuscript from Bohemia, scholars found a hymn where the left hand of the musical staff traced a mountain ridge, while the right hand's notes marked caves along its base, a literal topographical map set to music. The real stroke of genius was how these systems layered meanings. A single symbol could convey multiple pieces of information. The pitch indicated direction, the duration suggested distance, and the ornamentation hinted at terrain type. But who held the keys to these codes? Often, it was the choir master's trusted figures who taught novices through careful oral tradition. A young monk might spend years memorizing seemingly arbitrary rules before the full picture clicked into place. See how this phrase repeats 3 times. A mentor might murmur, "That means the path forks, and you must take the 3rd branch." Some monasteries even developed initiation rituals where newcomers proved their loyalty before being shown the hidden layers within familiar hymns. The system's security relied on this slow, personal transmission, far harder to intercept than a written key. Merchants and diplomats who relied on these maps faced their own challenges. A Venetian spice trader couldn't exactly stroll into a foreign abbey and ask for decoding lessons. Instead, they depended on intermediaries, often monks who'd left the cloister to serve as guides. These figures, sometimes called song sherpas, were the unsung heroes of medieval travel. Fluent in both music and geography, they could glance at a hymn book and instantly visualize the route ahead, adjusting for season, weather, or political unrest. Their expertise didn't come cheap, but for caravans carrying silks or spices, the cost was a small price to pay for safe passage. The impact on trade was profound. Routes that would have been impassable due to bandits or border wars remained open, all because a melody could say what a map dared not. Tax records from Genoa show that certain trade corridors mysteriously stayed active even during conflicts, precisely the ones later linked to hymn-mapped paths. Some merchant families even developed their own musical shorthand, adding subtle marks to hymn books to note which warehouses offered fair prices or which harbors had corrupt officials. This wasn't just navigation, it was an entire underground economy moving to the rhythm of sacred music. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how these systems adapted to different cultures. In Moorish Spain, where Christian and Islamic musical traditions mingled, scribes incorporated microtonal flourishes to mark oases in the desert. Celtic monasteries in Ireland used intricate knotwork in hymn initials to symbolize the interlacing paths of bog roads. Each region's challenges shaped its cipher, proof that necessity doesn't just invent solutions, it refines them into art. The legacy of these codes lingers in unexpected places. Modern cryptographers studying the hymns have found patterns that predate formal cipher theory by centuries. And if you listen closely to some folk melodies passed down through generations, you might still catch echoes of old routes, a descending scale that once warned of a collapsed bridge, or a buoyant refrain marking the first sight of a friendly town. The maps may have faded, but the music remembers. Imagine a merchant in the 13th century, his cart loaded with Flemish wool, staring down a mountain pass crawling with bandits. Without these musical maps, his journey might end in robbery or worse. But tucked in his sleeve is a hymn book from a Tuscan monastery, its melodies humming with hidden directions. That's the real power of this system. It didn't just save lives, it reshaped economies. Suddenly, goods could flow where armies couldn't, connecting markets that had been cut off for generations. Venetian glass reached Parisian nobles faster. English tin made its way to Moorish silversmiths. The very fabric of medieval commerce depended on these unassuming choir books, turning what should have been impassable frontiers into bustling trade corridors. The impact was especially profound for smaller communities. Remote villages along these secret routes blossomed into vital way stations, offering food, repairs, and safe lodging to those who knew the right melodies. Inns that once struggled to survive found themselves at the heart of an underground network, their locations marked by subtle cues in the music. A sustained note might indicate a generous innkeeper, while a trill could warn of greedy toll collectors. Artisans thrived too. Blacksmiths near hidden fords specialized in repairing wagon axles, while weavers in alpine valleys produced the thick cloaks needed for high-altitude crossings. This wasn't just trade, it was an entire ecosystem built on trust and coded songs. Cultural exchange flourished alongside commerce. A minstrel carrying a hymn book from Burgundy to Hungary didn't just bring directions, he carried new musical techniques, recipes, even architectural ideas hidden in the margins. Scholars tracing these routes have found startling patterns. The sudden appearance of French stained glass methods in Polish churches, or the spread of Andalusian irrigation tricks to German vineyards. The maps became conduits for knowledge, proving that borders couldn't contain human ingenuity. Even languages evolved along these paths. The hybrid dialects of border regions often borrowed words from the hymns themselves, with terms for landmarks or distances pulled straight from sacred lyrics. Some of the most fascinating evidence comes from toll records. In the archives of a Swiss monastery, ledgers show a curious pattern. Certain merchants consistently paid lower tolls during wars or famines. Cross-referencing these names with surviving hymn books reveals why. They were using alternate routes mapped in the music, bypassing checkpoints entirely. Other documents hint at even cleverer tricks. A Florentine wool guild's records mention singing guides who could reduce travel time by a third, while a Baltic port's customs log lists an unusual exemption for choir masters carrying instructional materials. The system was so effective that some trading families treated their hymn books as heirlooms, passing down annotations like modern businesses guard trade secrets. But the true measure of this network's success lies in what didn't happen. Wars that should have strangled commerce, like the decades-long conflict between France and England, somehow saw goods still moving. Pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela continued even when kings forbade travel. The maps didn't just avoid obstacles, they created a parallel world where normal rules didn't apply. A lord might control the roads, but he couldn't stop a farmer humming a melody that led through his fallow fields. A bishop could ban travel, but not the quiet singing of psalms that mapped goat trails over the mountains. The legacy lingers in plain sight. Many of Europe's oldest trade fairs still follow routes first charted in these hymns. The rhythm of medieval market days, often tied to saints' feasts mentioned in the lyrics, echoes in modern festival calendars. Even the layout of some historic towns reflects the priorities of those old maps, with wide alleys designed for carts turning at angles marked by long-ago musical phrases. What began as a survival tactic became the invisible scaffolding of an entire era's prosperity. Yet for all their sophistication, these maps carried a quiet irony. The very forces they helped unleash, easier travel, richer trade, would eventually make them obsolete. By the late Middle Ages, improved roads and stronger central governments reduced the need for secrecy. Printing presses made conventional maps cheaper, while standardized currencies simplified transactions. But for a few extraordinary centuries, when the world was fractured and dangerous, a chorus of voices kept the pathways open, not with swords or gold, but with ink, parchment, and the universal language of music. To the medieval mind, these map-bearing hymns weren't just tools, they were answered prayers. Imagine standing at the edge of a war-torn valley, clutching a choir book like a lifeline, believing the very notes on the page carried God's hand guiding you forward. This was faith made tangible. The same melodies that praised the heavens also charted the earth, blurring the line between devotion and direction in ways that modern maps could never replicate. For travelers, each step along a hymn-marked route wasn't just navigation. It was pilgrimage, every landmark a testament to divine providence. Take the story of the Hymn of the Three Springs, a melody still sung in some alpine villages today. According to legend, a group of monks lost in a blizzard sang it desperately, and as the final note faded, the wind shifted, revealing three steaming thermal springs that led them to safety. Whether miracle or coincidence, the tale spread, and soon the hymn became a staple for crossing that pass. Pilgrims would sing it at the exact spot where the monks had stopped, not just to mark the route but to invoke the same protection. The springs themselves were later found to align perfectly with three high notes in the score, as if the music had traced them into existence. This spiritual layering transformed ordinary journeys into sacred acts. A merchant avoiding bandits by following a hymn's hidden path might see his survival not as luck, but as proof of heavenly favor. The lyrics themselves reinforced this. Phrases like, "The Lord is my shepherd," took on literal meaning when paired with symbols for grazing lands safe from wolves. Even the physical books were treated as relics. Some choir books show signs of being kissed or touched reverently, their pages worn thin not just from use, but from generations of travelers seeking blessing through contact. The connection ran deeper than symbolism. Medieval cosmology saw the earth as a mirror of the divine order, rivers as veins of creation, mountains as steps to heaven. By encoding geography into hymns, scribes weren't just hiding maps, they were revealing the sacred geometry of the world itself. A melody that traced a river's curve might echo the celestial harmonies philosophers believed governed the universe. To sing such a hymn was to participate in that cosmic order, aligning human movement with God's design. This belief gave the maps an almost mystical authority. In one account from Normandy, a widow insisted her son follow a particular hymn's route after dreaming of its notes glowing like stars. He arrived unharmed despite crossing a battlefield, a story that bolstered the hymn's reputation for generations. Other melodies were said to lose their power if sung with impure intentions, their directions becoming muddled for those who sought profit over piety. The maps didn't just guide the body, they tested the soul. Yet the spiritual dimension also had practical roots. Many route-bearing hymns were dedicated to saints associated with travel: Christopher, Julian the Hospitaller, or Bridget of Kildare, whose cloak famously expanded to mark land boundaries. Invoking them wasn't just superstition, it was a way to tap into communal knowledge. A verse mentioning Saint Leonard, patron of prisoners, might signal a path near a monastery known for ransoming captives, offering both physical and spiritual refuge. The hymns became woven into local lore, with each generation adding layers of meaning like scribes annotating a manuscript. What's often overlooked is how this fusion of faith and geography shaped medieval art. Illuminators depicted rivers as flowing from Eden, mountains as stairways to saints. Even the musical notation itself took on sacred forms, notes shaped like crosses, staff lines mimicking cathedral arches. To sing these maps was to walk through a landscape alive with holy presence, where every turn held the potential for revelation. The legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Modern pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago still report feeling an uncanny sense of direction when singing certain medieval hymns, as if the melodies themselves remember the old paths. And perhaps they do. In an age where GPS coordinates can't capture the awe of a moonlit pass or the comfort of a lantern in a distant window, these hymns remind us that the best maps don't just show the way, they make the journey sacred. By the 15th century, the delicate art of encoding maps into hymns began to vanish, not with a bang, but with the quiet turning of a printing press. The invention of movable type didn't just revolutionize books, it made maps cheaper, more accurate, and far easier to conceal. Suddenly, a merchant could fold a printed chart into his boot instead of memorizing melodies, and a diplomat could slip a slim atlas between his robes without raising suspicion. The very technology that had once preserved knowledge in monastery scriptoriums now rendered their secret methods obsolete. Yet the shift wasn't just technological, it was political. As kingdoms consolidated power, rulers invested in better roads and standardized tolls, reducing the need for covert routes. A French royal decree in 1482 ordered the destruction of all false songbooks bearing hidden marks, signaling how seriously authorities viewed these musical maps as threats to control. The irony was palpable. The same centralized governments that had once spurred the need for secrecy now stamped it out. Still, the old ways didn't disappear overnight. In remote regions like the Scottish Highlands or Carpathian Mountains, where printed maps often failed to capture shifting clan territories or seasonal paths, hymn mapping persisted well into the 16th century. A surviving ledger from a Transylvanian monastery lists payments to scribes for correcting the singing maps as late as 1534. Even as the practice waned, its influence seeped into unexpected places. Early printed maps sometimes included musical notations in their margins, not as functional guides, but as nods to the tradition. A famous Venetian world map from 1511 features tiny choir books floating in the seas, perhaps a cartographer's private joke. The most enduring legacy, though, lay in the people who'd relied on these systems. Guilds of singing guides transitioned to leading legal trade caravans, their knowledge of old hymn-marked routes giving them an edge. Some became the first postal couriers, their ability to recall landscapes from memory proving invaluable for new national mail networks. And in a twist of fate, the very monasteries that had pioneered these maps became their archivists, not to preserve the practice, but to study it as a curiosity of a bygone age. What's remarkable is how thoroughly the art was forgotten. By the Enlightenment, scholars dismissed accounts of musical maps as superstitious folklore, assuming medieval travelers couldn't possibly have navigated so precisely without proper cartography. It wasn't until the 19th century, when historians began cross-referencing old hymn manuscripts with rediscovered pilgrim diaries, that the truth re-emerged. A German musicologist's accidental discovery in 1889, realizing a hymn's odd intervals matched the bends of a ruined Roman road, opened the floodgates. Suddenly, libraries across Europe were re-examining their collections, finding hidden geographies in plain sight. The practice may have faded, but its philosophy endured. In an age of satellite precision, There's something haunting about maps that required not just sight, but listening, where knowledge lived in hummed melodies and trusted voices rather than pixels on a screen. Perhaps that's why modern hikers on the Camino still report feeling drawn to certain paths when old hymns are sung, or why alpine shepherds swear storms ease when particular notes carry on the wind. The maps are gone, but the land remembers. The 20th century brought an unexpected revival of these forgotten musical maps, not through whispered hymns, but through the cold glow of ultraviolet light. Historians poring over medieval manuscripts began noticing faint markings invisible to the naked eye, guidelines scribbled in now faded ink, or subtle indentations where quills had pressed too deeply. What first seemed like scribble errors turned out to be the skeleton keys to a lost cartographic language. In a Munich archive, a researcher examining a 14th century antiphona under special lighting gasped as the page transformed. The seemingly random flourishes around a musical staff suddenly connected into a perfect outline of the Danube's bends near Regensburg. Technology became the unsung hero of these rediscoveries. Multispectral imaging, developed for analyzing ancient papyri, revealed layers of corrections in hymn books where monks had updated routes as landscapes shifted. Digital overlays allowed scholars to compare musical notation with surviving medieval maps, uncovering startling matches. One breakthrough came when a team at Oxford synced a 12th century hymn's melody with a three-dimensional terrain model. The notes' rises and falls aligned precisely with elevation changes along the old Via Francigena pilgrimage road. Suddenly, the abstract became tangible. A single page could hold both a sacred song and a topographic survey. The real turning point arrived with crowd-sourced research. When a Spanish musicologist posted high-resolution scans of a cryptic choir book online, amateur codebreakers worldwide noticed patterns professionals had missed. A retired engineer in Toronto realized the spacing between neumes matched Roman mile markers still standing in Catalonia. A Hungarian folk singer recognized a melody fragment as identical to a shepherd's tune from her village, a tune locals still used to navigate mountain passes. This grassroots effort proved these maps weren't just academic curiosities. They were living traditions that had lingered in plain sight. Perhaps the most poignant discovery came from the margins, literally. Tiny annotations once dismissed as doodles revealed themselves as vital keys. In a Bohemian manuscript, what appeared to be a crude drawing of a dog near a hymn's closing bars turned out to mark a watchtower where real hounds were kept to deter bandits. Another book's seemingly random ink blots aligned with marshland ponds when overlaid on satellite images. These weren't mistakes, they were medieval GPS markers placed where travelers needed them most. The implications rewrote history books. Trade routes once assumed impassable during certain periods showed evidence of continuous use, explaining how goods moved despite wars. Pilgrimage records suddenly made sense why certain paths were favored even when longer, or why some travelers miraculously avoided disasters that befell others. Even the spread of architectural styles found new explanations. Stonemasons likely carried not just tools but hymn books with hidden directions to distant quarries. Yet the greatest revelation was how widespread the practice had been. A Vatican library inventory uncovered over 60 previously misclassified choir books with map features, while a cache found in a Moldavian monastery contained hymns marking routes as far as Constantinople. This wasn't a fringe phenomenon. It was a sophisticated, pan-European system operating under the cloak of devotion. The very ubiquity that once hid these maps in plain sight now made them indispensable for understanding how medieval people truly navigated their fractured world. Modern technology continues to peel back layers. Artificial intelligence analyzing thousands of hymns has identified recurring musical fingerprints, tied to specific geographic features, a particular sequence of intervals that almost always indicates a river crossing, or a rhythmic pattern signaling mountain switchbacks. Linguists even traced dialect shifts along these melody-mapped routes, showing how language traveled with the traders and pilgrims who relied on them. What began as historical curiosity has become a new lens for viewing the Middle Ages not as a dark age of stagnation, but as an era of ingenious, covert connection. The most humbling lesson: some of these routes still work. In 2018, a group of historians attempted to follow a decoded hymn's directions through the Pyrenees. Despite centuries of erosion and landslides, the melody's cues led them safely along forgotten herding paths, paths now documented not on any modern map, but preserved note by note in parchment 800 years old. It's a reminder that the past often leaves its wisdom in unexpected places, waiting for those willing to listen closely enough to hear it. Hidden maps in medieval hymns don't just reveal forgotten routes, they shatter the myth of the Middle Ages as an era of unrelenting division. For centuries, history books painted this period as a time of walled cities, isolated villages, and endless warfare. But these musical codes tell a different story, one of quiet collaboration stretching across enemy lines. Take the case of a 12th century hymn book from Cluny, its pages secretly guiding travelers through both Christian and Muslim-held territories in Spain. The same melody that led pilgrims to Santiago also directed Jewish merchants to safe harbors and Moorish scholars to shared libraries. This wasn't just survival, it was a silent rebellion against the very idea that borders could halt the flow of people and ideas. The implications ripple through modern scholarship. Historians studying trade records have long puzzled over how certain goods like Byzantine silk or Persian spices appeared in markets supposedly cut off by war. Now we know the answer hummed in plain sight. A Florentine wool trader might follow a hymn's path through Burgundian battlefields, while a Catalan diplomat used another melody to bypass blocked mountain passes. These routes didn't just skirt danger, they created an underground economy where cooperation trumped conflict. Tax rolls from Marseille show merchants from rival cities paying tolls at the same hidden fords, their rivalry suspended by the shared language of music. What's even more startling is how these maps expose networks of trust that official records ignored. In the shadow of the 100 Years' War, a Cistercian monastery in Normandy became a clearinghouse for route updates, receiving intelligence from English wool merchants and French knights alike. Their choir books, filled with seemingly innocuous hymn corrections, held coded warnings about which lords could be bribed and which bridges were sabotaged. This wasn't the work of rogue actors, it was systemic. Kings might declare embargoes, but the people through these songs found ways to keep talking, trading, and traveling. The maps also challenge assumptions about medieval technology. We often assume precise navigation required compasses or astrolabes, yet these melodies achieved startling accuracy using only memory and melody. A hymn from Salzburg could guide a traveler through 20 miles of alpine switchbacks with margin of error under half a mile, all without a single written direction. That precision speaks to an oral tradition far more sophisticated than previously credited, one where knowledge wasn't just stored in books but woven into the very rhythms of daily life. Perhaps most profoundly, these hidden paths reveal how ordinary people resisted the narratives imposed by power. When feudal lords demanded allegiance, when bishops decreed heresy, when wars tried to redraw human connections, the hymns kept other channels open. A peasant humming an old tune might not know he was carrying rebel geography, but with every note, he helped sustain a world where cooperation outlasted conquest. That's the real heresy hidden in these maps, proof that even in the darkest ages, light found a way to travel. Creating these hidden maps demanded more than just musical or cartographic skill. It required a rare fusion of disciplines where scribes became cryptographers, composers transformed into surveyors, and illuminators doubled as covert strategists. Picture the scene in a candlelit scriptorium. A monk hunched over parchment, quill in one hand and a traveler's rough sketch in the other, translating jagged mountain contours into graceful melodic arcs. Every stroke had to serve dual purposes. The notes must please the ear in chapel while guiding the feet through treacherous terrain. This wasn't just craftsmanship, it was high-stakes artistry under the guise of devotion. The scribes who perfected this art were masters of precision. Working with quills cut to hair's width sharpness, they could adjust the pressure of a single stroke to convey multiple meanings. A slightly thickened note might indicate a steep incline, while a faint, trailing tail could signal a hidden fork in the trail. Some developed personalized shorthand, tiny flourishes resembling bird wings to mark lookout points, or subtle loops in the staff lines to denote villages with fresh horses. The best among them could pack an entire day's journey into a single stanza, their notation so exact that modern researchers have retraced their routes with GPS and found deviations of less than 100 paces. Composers faced an even trickier challenge, crafting melodies that felt spiritually uplifting while adhering to geographic realities. A hymn meant to guide travelers through the Loire Valley, for instance, might use a flowing, undulating melody to mirror the river's path, then suddenly shift to dissonant intervals where tributaries caused confusing splits in the road. Rhythms mirrored the pace of travel, languid whole notes for flat plains, frantic clusters of eighth notes for narrow passes requiring quick movement. The genius lay in making these musical choices sound intentional to the untrained ear. A congregation might sense the urgency in a particular phrase without realizing it was a warning to hurry past a bandit-infested thicket. Illuminators added yet another layer of deception. Those lavish initials and border decorations weren't just for beauty, they became hiding places for crucial details. In one stunning example from a Swiss monastery, the vine scrolls of a capital M conceal a miniature map of the Gotthard Pass, with berries marking shelters and thorns indicating avalanche zones. Other illuminators used color symbolism, gold leaf highlighting safe routes, while muted greens hinted at marshy areas to avoid. The most audacious even painted entire landscapes into choir robes, their folds becoming valleys when the garment was worn, then vanishing when hung flat. What's often overlooked is how collaborative the process was. A single hymn book might pass through a dozen hands before completion, a composer drafting the melody, a scribe encoding the route, an illuminator embedding clues in the artwork, and finally, a choir master adding oral instructions for decoding. This wasn't a solitary act of genius, but a symphony of specialized skills, each contributor trusting the others to safeguard the secret. Perhaps that's why so many of these manuscripts bear tiny, hidden signatures, a scribe's initials tucked into a note stem, or an illuminator's face peering from a marginal grotesque. They knew they weren't just making music, they were crafting lifelines. The materials themselves became tools of subterfuge. Some scribes used iron gall ink with unusual additives, walnut oil, to make certain strokes fade over time, ensuring routes could be discreetly updated. Parchment was carefully selected. Thinner sheets allowed impressions to show through from the back, creating phantom guides visible only when held to light. Even the binding held secrets. One Bohemian choir book had compass directions tooled into the leather spine, readable only by running fingertips across the raised patterns. Yet for all their ingenuity, these artisans left behind few explicit records of their methods. The closest we get are cryptic notes in margins, like a scribe's remark about singing the hills into being, or an illuminator's diary entry praising Saint Christopher for steadying his hand as he drew the ford. Their silence wasn't just professional discretion, it was survival. In an age when such knowledge could mean the difference between freedom and a dungeon, the greatest skill of all may have been knowing when to whisper and when to let the music speak for itself. Secret messages have taken countless forms across history, but few blend artistry and utility as seamlessly as those medieval hymn maps. Consider the ancient Greeks who scraped messages into wax tablets only to melt them away after reading, a clever trick, but one that destroyed the information after use. Or take the elaborate cipher discs of Renaissance cryptographers, beautiful in their complexity yet requiring cumbersome decoding tools. What sets the musical maps apart is how they turned necessity into something transcendent. Unlike spy codes meant for a single pair of eyes or wartime ciphers designed to be brief, these hymns had to endure hidden not just for one journey but for generations, disguised not as secrets but as sacred objects worthy of preservation. The closest cousins to these musical maps might be the quilt codes of the Underground Railroad, where patterns and colors signaled safe houses to escaping slaves. Both systems transformed everyday objects, hymnbooks, quilts into lifelines, relying on communities to keep their meanings alive through oral tradition. Yet where quilt codes used visual symbolism, the hymn maps achieved something even more remarkable. They encoded geography into sound. A fleeing family could carry a quilt, but a traveling merchant needed nothing more than a melody memorized in childhood to navigate hostile lands. World War II's famous numbers stations, radio broadcasts of seemingly random digits shared the same goal of covert communication, but lacked the medieval system's elegant duality. Those crackling transmissions served no purpose beyond espionage, while a hymn could inspire devotion even as it guided travelers. This dual nature gave the musical maps extraordinary resilience. When authorities in 1532 Bavaria banned suspicious choir books, they couldn't erase the routes entirely. The same directions lived on in the memories of countless worshippers who saw them only as songs of faith. Perhaps the most striking contrast lies with modern digital steganography, where data hides in plain sight within image files or audio tracks. The principle seems similar, embedding secrets within innocuous carriers, but the execution lacks the human ingenuity of those medieval scribes. A computer algorithm can conceal a message in pixel noise, but it takes a monk's trained hand to make a river's curve flow naturally as a musical phrase. The old maps didn't just conceal information, they married it to beauty, ensuring their survival not through encryption strength but through cultural value. What truly sets these musical codes apart is their universality. Most cryptographic systems serve narrow purposes: military orders, diplomatic secrets, criminal plots. But the hymn maps aided everyone from wool merchants to refugee families, their usefulness limited only by the reach of Christianity itself. A Venetian glassblower and a Flemish nun might never speak the same language, but they could follow the same melodic path through the Alps. In an age before standardized road signs or common maps, these songs created something revolutionary: a shared navigation language that crossed borders, classes, and even allegiances, all while sounding like praise to heaven. The legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern air traffic controllers use melodic, prosody, rising and falling vocal tones to convey urgency without words, eerily echoing how medieval hymns used pitch changes to signal terrain shifts. Emergency responders in avalanche-prone regions still teach whistle codes that mirror the old musical maps' staccato warnings. Even children's games preserve fragments of this tradition. The hopscotch chant that traces a path with its rhythm, the jump rope rhyme that counts off safe steps. These aren't direct descendants, but they share the same ingenious spirit, turning rhythm and melody into tools for survival. At their core, the hymn maps represent a pinnacle of human creativity. not just hiding messages, but weaving them into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that they became inseparable from culture itself. Other secret codes fade when their purpose ends, but 8 centuries later, we're still piecing together the routes hidden in those fading parchments. That's the power of a system that doesn't just conceal, but enchants, that doesn't merely inform, but endures. The real genius wasn't in making the maps disappear, it was in making them unforgettable. Pilgrimage routes were the lifeblood of medieval spirituality, but they were also perilous gauntlets of bandits, political borders, and natural hazards. Hidden within the hymns sung at roadside shrines and monastery chapels lay the keys to survival musical maps that turned sacred journeys into acts of both devotion and defiance. Consider the Via Francigena, the 1,000-mile trail from Canterbury to Rome. While official guides warned pilgrims to stick to well-patrolled roads, coded hymns revealed alternate paths through the forests of Burgundy, where sympathetic Cistercian monks kept hearths burning for those who knew the right melodies. These musical maps didn't just point the way, they embedded theology into terrain. A hymn dedicated to Saint Michael might trace a path through the Apennines, its soaring high notes matching the archangel's legendary peaks, while a somber refrain signaled valleys associated with purgatory in medieval thought. The landscape itself became a scripture to be read, with each mountain pass and river crossing reflecting biblical archetypes. Pilgrims didn't merely travel to holy sites, they walked through living allegories, their routes composed as carefully as any sermon. The Camino de Santiago offers one of the clearest examples. Modern researchers comparing 12th century antiphoners with the trail's ancient footpaths found eerie correlations. A specific sequence of notes in the Codex Calixtinus, a hymn praising St. James, aligns perfectly with a forgotten coastal variant of the route, its staccato rhythms mirroring the tidal flats pilgrims had to cross at low tide. Even more remarkably, the hymn's structure changes as it approaches Compostela. The melody broadens into sustained, reverent tones, musically recreating the awe of finally glimpsing the cathedral spires. But these maps also served darker purposes. During the Albigensian Crusade, when Cathar heretics fled through the Pyrenees, Cistercian monks smuggled escape routes into hymns about the Good Shepherd, their notes sketching hidden goat trails to Aragon. Similarly, Jewish travelers adapting Christian hymns for their own pilgrimages to Jerusalem would modify certain intervals, turning Marian devotionals into covert guides to synagogues offering shelter. The same musical language that exalted saints could also subvert persecution, proving faith's geography was never monolithic. The miracle of this system lay in its adaptability. A single hymn book could serve multiple purposes, its official text guiding a German noble to Rome, while marginal notations in invisible ink directed a Byzantine spy to safe houses in Venice. Some pilgrimage maps even accounted for seasonal shifts. A spring melody might follow riverbanks, while its winter counterpart switched to inland ridges less prone to flooding. This wasn't static cartography, it was a living dialogue between landscape and liturgy, constantly updated by the whispered reports of those who'd walked the roads last. What emerges is a vision of medieval pilgrimage far more nuanced than the typical image of dusty foot travelers. These were navigators decoding sacred scores, their journeys measured not just in miles but in melodic phrases. When a monk scribbled a tiny cross over a particular note, he wasn't just marking a turn in the road, he was creating a waypoint where earthly and divine journeys intersected. The paths may have faded, but the music remains, a ghostly atlas of faith, still audible in the chant of modern pilgrims who unknowingly walk routes their ancestors first sang into existence. The glowing screens of our smartphones may seem worlds apart from parchment hymnbooks, but the DNA of modern digital maps pulses with medieval ingenuity. Those hidden musical routes didn't just vanish, they evolved. Take the way modern navigation apps like Waze crowdsource real-time traffic updates. The concept mirrors how monks once gathered whispers from merchants and pilgrims to tweak their hymn-mapped routes. A red line on your screen warning of a jammed highway serves the same purpose as a staccato note in a 12th century melody signaling bandits ahead. Both are living maps, adapting to the chaos of the world in real time. Even the layered data of today's mapping tools owes a nod to medieval scribes. When you toggle between satellite, terrain, and traffic views on Google Maps, you're using the same principle that let a single choir book hold multiple route variants, one melody for summer when rivers were low, another for spring floods. Modern hiking apps like All Trails encode difficulty levels into color-coded paths, just as illuminators used gold leaf for safe routes and muted greens for marshes. The interfaces changed, but the philosophy of layered, context-sensitive navigation remains strikingly familiar. The most profound parallel lies in how both systems balance secrecy and accessibility. Medieval hymns hid maps in plain sight. Today's digital maps hide staggering complexity behind intuitive icons. When you drag a pin to drop a location, algorithms weighing satellite imagery, street view data, and user corrections work invisibly, much like how a traveler humming a hymn didn't need to understand the quill strokes that encoded it. Both systems trust the user to follow, not decipher, yet some medieval techniques still outshine their digital descendants. Researchers at Stanford recently found that hikers using GPS in the Swiss Alps made more wrong turns than those following old musical routes because the hymns accounted for micro-terrain like loose scree slopes that flat maps overlook. It's a humbling reminder that parchment and memory once achieved precision our satellites still struggle to match in certain landscapes. The legacy thrives in unexpected corners. Urban explorers rediscovering abandoned railway lines often rely on century-old surveys, some originally based on monastic maps. Disaster responders in flood zones sometimes consult medieval river hymns to predict erosion patterns, since the songs preserved centuries of observational wisdom. Even the gamification of modern apps like Strava, where users compete to chart new bike routes, echoes the playful rivalry between monastic scribes racing to document the fastest passes. What medieval mapmakers understood and what we're relearning is that the best navigation systems aren't just tools, they're conversations between people and place. Every time Waze reroutes you based on another driver's report, or a trail app warns of a washed-out bridge, we're participating in the same collaborative cartography that once flowed from the tips of monks' quills. The parchment may have digitized, but the human impulse to guide each other through the wilderness remains unchanged. Somewhere in a dusty cathedral archive or a forgotten monastery chest, there could be a choir book holding routes no living person has walked for centuries. Scholars estimate that less than 15% of surviving medieval manuscripts have been thoroughly analyzed for hidden maps, meaning hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these musical guides still wait silently between gilt-edged pages. Take the case of the lost hymn of the Seven Springs, mentioned in a 14th century monk's diary as leading to healing waters near Montpellier. Despite decades of searching, no one has found the original manuscript. Yet local shepherds still sing fragments of a melody matching the diary's description, its notes tracing a path through vineyards to a grove where 7 mineral springs bubble up exactly where the hymn promised they would. The hunt for these missing maps isn't just academic, it's a race against time. Many manuscripts are deteriorating faster than they can be studied. In a Moldavian monastery 2 years ago, researchers discovered a water-damaged choir book where ultraviolet light revealed ghostly notations along the margins. what might be a lost trade route linking Wallachia to Transylvania. But the ink is fading daily, and funding for preservation is scarce. Other leads hide in plain sight. A Bavarian library holds a seemingly ordinary 15th century graduale with peculiar smudges near certain saints' feasts, smudges that, when magnified, resolve into tiny compass roses and distance markers. No one's yet deciphered the full system, but the clues suggest it once guided pilgrims around a now-vanished lake. Amateurs are making startling breakthroughs too. A retired music teacher in Portugal recently noticed that a hymn dedicated to Saint Anthony contained odd rhythmic pauses. Plotting them on a map revealed stops along a medieval herring trader's route from Brittany to Flanders, a path previously unknown to historians. Similarly, a Danish choir director realized that the soaring intervals in a long-dismissed, out-of-tune antiphon actually marked safe fjord crossings during spring thaws. These discoveries prove you don't need a PhD to spot hidden patterns. Sometimes fresh ears hear what specialists overlook. The most tantalizing gaps lie in the shadows of history. Crusader-era manuscripts from the Levant reportedly contained hymns mapping secret paths to Edessa and Antioch, but most were destroyed during Saladin's conquests. Could copies survive in Venetian or Genoese archives? Likewise, Norse sagas mention song charts used by Christian missionaries in Greenland melodies that may have encoded sled routes across glaciers. With climate change exposing previously ice-locked areas, those long-frozen maps could suddenly become relevant again. Technology is unlocking doors faster than ever. Artificial intelligence analyzing thousands of digitized hymns has flagged hundreds with unusual patterns, like a cluster of Bohemian manuscripts where the same melodic sequence appears only in books from mining regions, suggesting a coded silver route. Spectral imaging recently revealed that a blank page in a Spanish antiphona actually held a vanished sketch of the Camino's most dangerous alternate path, erased during the Inquisition. Even sound analysis plays a role. Software can now detect subtle notational quirks, a note slightly flattened here, a rhythm subtly altered there that human eyes might miss. But the real magic happens when old maps meet modern footsteps. Last year, a team followed a newly decoded hymn through the Dolomites, using its trills and cadences to locate a crumbling hospice mentioned in no existing records. Elsewhere, a historian singing a reconstructed melody in Burgundy's forests stumbled upon a medieval boundary stone exactly where the music's climax predicted. These aren't just academic exercises, they're resurrections of lost worlds, note by note. The search continues in unlikely places. An auction catalog might list a minor antiphona with marginalia that's actually a smuggler's atlas. A family Bible's flyleaf could conceal a pilgrim's route disguised as a psalm. Even church walls hold secrets. In Suffolk, restorers found musical notations scratched into plaster beneath whitewash, possibly marking a vanished sanctuary trail. Every discovery rewrites our understanding of how medieval people experienced their world, not as a fractured collection of isolated villages, but as a living network connected by song. What keeps scholars awake at night are the whispers of manuscripts that might never surface. A chronicle from Cluny mentions a singing map of the stars that guided nighttime desert crossings lost when the Library of Alexandria in the desert burned. Icelandic annals describe navigational hymns for Atlantic crossings, their parchments allegedly sunk with a Hanseatic cog, and somewhere, perhaps in a private collection or overlooked attic, there could still exist the legendary Cantus Viatorum, the traveler's songbook, said to contain melodies mapping every major pilgrimage route from Compostela to Jerusalem. Until these treasures resurface, their routes remain suspended between history and hope, waiting for the right pair of eyes or ears to bring them home. Unraveling the secrets of medieval hymn maps forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. When does preservation become intrusion? These melodies were never meant for academic journals or viral YouTube videos. They were sacred trusts passed between trusted hands under the threat of persecution. Modern researchers shining ultraviolet light onto fragile parchment are, in a very real sense, breaking centuries-old vows of secrecy. Consider the case of the St. Gall Codex, where scholars discovered route markers hidden in hymns dedicated to Saint Columba. The monks who created them likely believed they were safeguarding not just physical paths, but spiritual ones, encoding divine protection into the very notes. Does exposing these patterns honor their legacy or violate it? The tension between historical curiosity and cultural respect plays out in startling ways. In 2018, a team digitizing manuscripts from a Spanish monastery noticed faint annotations in a 15th century choir book, directions to hidden Jewish prayer spaces during the Inquisition. Local Jewish leaders were divided when approached. Some argued the discovery could help reclaim lost heritage. Others feared disturbing carefully guarded ancestral secrets. The compromise, redacting certain details while preserving the musical notation, highlights how these aren't just academic debates. They're living conversations with communities whose identities are entwined with these hidden histories. Even the technology we use to decode these maps carries ethical weight. Multispectral imaging can reveal erased or faded ink, but should we reconstruct routes that monks deliberately obscured? In Bavaria, researchers identified a hymn marking escape paths for heretics during the Albigensian Crusade, knowledge that could have meant torture if discovered then. Publishing such findings today might feel like justice, but it also risks commodifying what was once life-saving resistance. The same tools that help us understand the past can inadvertently flatten its complexity into mere data points. Then there's the question of unintended consequences. When a decoded hymn revealed a forgotten alpine pass in 2021, hiking groups immediately began retracing it, only to discover the route crossed private farmland and delicate ecosystems. The medieval map didn't account for modern property laws or endangered flora. This collision between ancient wisdom and contemporary realities shows how rediscovery isn't neutral, it ripples through living landscapes and communities. Perhaps the most profound ethical layer involves who gets to interpret these secrets. For decades, Western institutions dominated the study of European hymn maps, often overlooking oral traditions maintained by Eastern Orthodox and Coptic Christians. A breakthrough came when a Greek researcher recognized that what scholars called scribble errors in a Mount Athos manuscript actually matched Byzantine naval signals, proving the hymns had maritime navigation uses unknown to Western academia. This blind spot reminds us that decoding isn't just about technology, it's about whose knowledge we consider valid. The debate mirrors modern dilemmas over genetic testing or uncontacted tribes, where our ability to uncover secrets outpaces our consensus on whether we should. These hymns exist in a gray area between historical artifact and living tradition. For every scholar arguing that sunlight is the best disinfectant, there's a monk in a secluded monastery who'd say some truths were meant to stay veiled. The ink may have faded, but the questions remain fresh. Who owns the right to reveal? When does curiosity become appropriation? And in our rush to illuminate the past, might we extinguish the very mysteries that made it sacred? What's often missing from these discussions are the voices of those who still use similar techniques today. In Ethiopia's highlands, priests guard hymn books containing medicinal plant locations. In the Caucasus, shepherds sing melodies encoding avalanche-safe valleys. Their perspective is rarely included in academic papers, yet it offers crucial insight that some knowledge systems thrive precisely because they resist full translation. The medieval monks might have agreed. After all, they didn't hide their maps because the information was trivial, but because it was precious. As we stand before these rediscovered melodies, we're left weighing competing imperatives. The historian's drive to preserve, the scholar's hunger to understand, and the descendants' right to protect. Maybe the answer lies in approaching these hymns not as puzzles to solve, but as conversations to join. After 7 centuries, the music still has things to teach us, not just about where to go, but how to walk the path between reverence and revelation. Spotting a hidden map in a medieval hymn book isn't about stumbling upon a glaring X marks the spot. It's about learning to see the parchment as its creators did. Start with the musical notation itself. Look for unusual patterns where the melody seems to defy liturgical conventions, like a sudden leap in pitch where the text doesn't warrant it, or clusters of notes that form geometric shapes when viewed from a distance. A hymn from the Abbey of St. Gall, for instance, contains a series of zigzagging neumes that, when traced on parchment, mirror the switchbacks of a mountain pass in the Swiss Alps. These weren't compositional flourishes, they were deliberate cartographic choices. Marginalia holds even richer clues. A tiny doodle of a fish might seem like a scribe's idle sketch, until you realize it appears every 12 lines, matching the distance between river crossings along a trade route. Watch for annotations in unusual ink colors like faded red or brown, often used to mark hazards without drawing attention. One French manuscript hides ford locations in what appear to be accidental ink blots, their placement too precise to be random. And don't ignore the seemingly mundane. A row of faint dots along the edge of a page could scale to a day's journey, each representing a league between shelters. The lyrics themselves often whisper double meanings. A hymn praising St. Christopher's staff might emphasize the word steady in odd places, a cue to note where the path requires careful footing. Repeated phrases or abrupt shifts in syntax can signal transitions in terrain. In a Bohemian antiphona, the phrase "light in darkness" appears whenever the route passes a cave system used for shelter. The real trick is cross-referencing these textual quirks with the music. When the lyrics mention crossing waters as the melody dips into a rare low register, you've likely found a river crossing. Physical wear patterns on the parchment can betray a hymn's secret utility. Pages with route-bearing melodies often show more finger smudges or edge discoloration from frequent handling. Some manuscripts even have subtle indentations where travelers traced the notes with their fingertips, leaving behind a tactile map of their journey. In rare cases, ultraviolet light reveals faint underdrawings, quick sketches of landmarks later concealed beneath layers of ink and ornamentation. Seasoned researchers also listen as much as they look. Play the melody on a lute or harp and notice where the rhythm strains against the natural cadence of the words. These tension points often mark treacherous stretches of the route. A team in Catalonia recently proved this by hiking while singing a suspect hymn. The phrases that felt awkward to sing coincided exactly with cliffside paths requiring focused silence to avoid rockfalls. The most revealing clues, though, lie outside the books. Compare suspect hymns with pilgrim diaries or merchant ledgers from the same period. A hymn from Rheims Cathedral, once dismissed as overly repetitive, suddenly made sense when matched to a silk trader's account of 20 pauses along his route, each musical repetition marking a checkpoint. Local legends matter too. If villagers near an old monastery tell of a melody that guides lost shepherds home, there's likely cartographic truth beneath the folklore. But perhaps the surest sign of a hidden map lies in what's missing. Pages excised with razor precision, sections clumsily overwritten, or entire staves left suspiciously blank. These aren't accidents. They're evidence of maps being erased when routes became unsafe or knowledge needed protecting. In those empty spaces, the past isn't just hiding secrets, it's daring us to listen for the echoes of what once was sung. Modern technology has cracked open a window to the past, transforming those cryptic hymn notations into vivid, three-dimensional journeys. Picture this: a digital landscape unfurls on screen, the soaring peaks and winding rivers of medieval Europe rendered in crisp detail. And overlaid across this terrain, glowing musical notes trace the exact path a 12th century pilgrim would have followed. Projects like the digital choirbook atlas use spectral imaging to recover faded annotations, then marry them with geographic data to recreate routes lost for centuries. Suddenly, that odd melodic leap in a St. Gregory hymn makes perfect sense. It aligns precisely with a cliffside trail in the Dolomites where travelers needed to watch their step. The magic happens through layered visualization. One groundbreaking interface lets users toggle between the original manuscript and a satellite map, watching as holographic notes snap into place over mountain passes and river fords. Zoom in on a cluster of sharp staccato marks, and the view shifts to reveal a rocky gorge where the hymn warned travelers to move quickly. These tools don't just translate the maps, they reveal the scribe's astonishing precision. Measurements show some melodies charted distances with under 2% margin of error, equivalent to modern topographic surveys. What's truly revolutionary is how these digital reconstructions expose hidden patterns. Algorithms analyzing hundreds of hymn maps have identified recurring musical fingerprints, a specific sequence of intervals that almost always signals a river crossing, or a rhythmic pattern marking avalanche-prone slopes. The St. Gall Research Project discovered that certain hymns used microtonal shifts, notes slightly off standard pitch to indicate elevation changes, with each quarter tone representing roughly 50 feet of ascent. Suddenly, melodies once heard as purely spiritual reveal themselves as sophisticated altimeters. Interactive displays take the experience further. At the British Library's Medieval Soundscapes exhibit, visitors don VR headsets to walk a hymn-mapped route through medieval Burgundy. The landscape shifts with each musical phrase. When the choir sings of dark valleys, fog rolls in obscuring bandit ambush points. A triumphant major chord triggers sunlight breaking over a safe hilltop sanctuary. This isn't just visualization, it's time travel, letting modern ears hear what medieval travelers understood instinctively, that every note held life-saving meaning. Crowdsourcing has become the modern equivalent of monastic knowledge sharing. Platforms like Chantways invite users to upload photos of suspicious manuscripts, while hiking enthusiasts test theories on the ground. A schoolteacher in Austria recently proved that squiggles in a Salzburg antiphona matched her local shepherd's trails by singing the hymn while hiking her GPS track, overlaying perfectly with the notation. Such discoveries highlight how technology hasn't replaced human intuition, but amplified it, creating a global scriptorium where anyone can help decode the past. The most poignant reconstructions emerge when digital maps meet living traditions. In Catalonia, researchers paired a 13th century hymn with drone footage to rediscover a forgotten pilgrimage detour, only to find elderly villagers still humming fragments of the melody as a rain chant. The drone's aerial view revealed why. The path traced ancient ley lines linking 7 springs, their locations encoded in the hymn's 7 verses. Here, technology didn't just uncover a route. It reconnected a community with landscape lore their ancestors had carried for generations, note by fading note. Yet these tools also surface haunting questions. LiDAR scans of Swiss alpine routes show some hymn-marked paths now buried under glaciers, their melodies preserving geography lost to climate change. Other reconstructions reveal how political borders erased cultural connections. A single Hungarian hymn once guided travelers across what are now 4 hostile frontiers, its notes stitching together lands later torn apart by wars. The maps remember what history books forgot, a world where faith and geography flowed as one, unconstrained by the lines we've since drawn. The ultimate power of these digital resurrections lies in their imperfection. Glitches occur when medieval mile markers don't match modern GPS coordinates, or when a scribe's left turn at the oak points to a stump 8 centuries gone. These discrepancies aren't failures, they're invitations. Like monks receiving traveler updates, today's scholars adjust their models, bridging past and present through trial and error. The maps live again not as static artifacts, but as conversations across time, asking us to listen closely, not just to the notes, but to the landscapes they still long to reveal. These hidden maps did more than chart physical paths. They wove an invisible web of shared knowledge across a fractured continent. Consider the journey of a single choir book from a Moorish-influenced Spanish monastery to a Benedictine abbey in Germany. Along with its coded routes, it carried subtle musical flourishes, microtonal trills borrowed from Andalusian lute traditions, rhythmic patterns echoing North African drumming. A German monk copying the manuscript might not realize he was absorbing Moorish musical theory, but the evidence lingers in compositions that suddenly feature unexpected melodic turns. This wasn't just navigation, it was cultural osmosis disguised as sacred transcription. The exchange flowed both ways, a hymn composed in Normandy, its neumes mapping safe crossings of the Loire Valley, could wind up in Sicily within a generation, its notation now peppered with Arabic diacritical marks added by scribes in Palermo. The melodies themselves began to shift, incorporating Sicilian folk cadences that travelers had hummed along the route. What started as a practical guide became a living archive of sonic cross-pollination, each copied choir book preserving layers of regional styles like geological strata. Goods traveled these musical routes too, carrying cultural baggage alongside cargo. Venetian glassmakers following him marked paths to Flanders, brought not just their wares but techniques teaching local artisans how to produce the coveted cristallo glass in exchange for wool. Tax records from Bruges show entire neighborhoods of foreign craftsmen settled along melody-mapped trade corridors, their workshops clustered near the inns and stables highlighted in the songs. The maps didn't just connect places, they created hybrid spaces where traditions collided and merged. Languages also hitched rides on these covert routes. Linguistic scholars tracing dialect shifts along the Camino de Santiago found startling patterns. Certain phonetic changes radiated outward from way stations mentioned in hymn annotations. A distinctive Catalan lisp appears abruptly in Burgundian French near a monastery known for its musical maps, suggesting the sound spread with pilgrims and merchants who'd learned it singing guidance hymns. Even place names sometimes borrowed from the lyrics. The Provençal village of Saint Andreu dels Soms got its suffix from a local variant of a hymn that marked its fountain as a meeting point. Some exchanges were profoundly personal. A heartbreaking letter survives in the Genos archives from a spice merchant to his wife. He'd fallen ill following a hymn's directions to a Hungarian monastery, where Slavic monks nursed him with herbal remedies from their own musical pharmacopoeia. The recipe he brought home, scribbled in the margin of his choir book, became a staple treatment for fever in Liguria. Such small, intimate transfers, a lullaby learned at a Swiss hospice, a bread recipe shared at a Burgundian ford, accumulated into a quiet revolution in daily life across Europe. The maps also facilitated intellectual smuggling. When the University of Paris banned certain Aristotelian texts in the 13th century, scholars reportedly encoded excerpts into hymn notations, their controversial philosophies hiding in plain sight amid pious lyrics. A choir book at Oxford's Bodleian Library shows telltale signs, oddly placed neumes that, when read as Greek shorthand, outline passages from forbidden commentaries. This underground network of knowledge kept ideas circulating even when authorities tried to dam the flow. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the arts. Frescoes in Bavarian churches suddenly feature Byzantine gold leaf techniques after hymn-mapped routes reopened following the Crusades. A Flemish painter's depiction of Saint Jerome shows him studying a choir book rather than a Bible, a wink to contemporary viewers who recognized these manuscripts as vessels of worldly wisdom too. The maps didn't just carry culture, they reshaped how people visualized their connection to the wider world. This clandestine web of exchange challenges our image of the Middle Ages as isolated and insular. Beneath the surface of wars and plagues, ordinary people, merchants humming hymns, scribes tweaking notations, housewives stitching route markers into tapestries were knitting together a continent long before kings dreamed of empires. The real borders weren't between kingdoms, but between those who could hear the maps in the music and those who passed by deaf to their secrets. Behind every choir book that survived the Middle Ages, there's often an untold story of women who preserved them. While monastic scribes dominated the creation of these musical maps, it was nuns, noble women, and even ordinary village healers who ensured their survival during wars, purges, and political upheavals. Take the case of Abbess Hildegard of Bingen's Rhineland convent in the 12th century. Her meticulously annotated antiphoners didn't just contain celestial harmonies but practical routes through the war-torn valleys below. Scholars recently discovered that her hymn O Virga Esi Diadema hides a path to medicinal springs, its rising melodic lines mirroring the elevation gain needed to reach them. This wasn't accidental. Hildegard famously trained her nuns in both music and herbology, blending spiritual devotion with earthly navigation. Convents became sanctuaries for these endangered manuscripts. When the Albigensian Crusade raged across southern France, Cistercian nuns near Toulouse smuggled coded choir books in hollowed-out reliquaries, their embroidery needles scratching tiny route updates into the margins. One such book, now in the Cluny Museum, shows faint stitching along certain staff lines, a tactile map for travelers who couldn't risk lighting candles to read. These women didn't just protect the maps, they refined them. A nun's diary from 15th century Flanders describes how sisters would interview wounded pilgrims, then adjust hymn notations to reflect new dangers. Sister Margareta did set the Agnus Dei higher where the river swallows men. Beyond cloister walls, noblewomen leveraged their status to shield these secrets. Elena of Aquitaine's court hosted troubadours who performed seemingly innocuous ballads, melodies that, when slowed to a walking pace, traced safe passages through Plantagenet-Angevin conflict zones. Her daughter Marie of Champagne went further, commissioning lavishly illuminated choir books where route markers hid in the jeweled hems of painted saints' robes. To casual observers, these were displays of piety. To those initiated, they were lifelines. Even the parchment itself sometimes bore feminine fingerprints, literally. Analysis of a Burgundian gradual revealed traces of lavender oil and beeswax in the binding, clues that it had been stored in a noblewoman's clothing chest, its scent masking it from sniffing hounds during searches. The most ingenious preservation happened at the grassroots. Midwives in alpine villages taught birthing songs that doubled as avalanche escape routes, their rhythms matching the sprint needed to reach stone shelters. A Catalan folklorist in the 1920s recorded an elderly woman humming a lullaby that perfectly traced a Roman road. Local shepherds still used a melody her grandmother had learned from Benedictine nuns centuries prior. These oral traditions often filled gaps left by destroyed manuscripts, proving that some maps lived not on parchment, but in the breath and bone of those who sang them. What's often missed is how women expanded the map's purpose. While many male scribes focused on trade and pilgrimage routes, female custodians frequently encoded locations of practical refugia, herbalists' huts where travelers could find poultices for blistered feet, or widows' cottages that offered shelter to fleeing heretics. A hymn book from a Bohemian beguinage includes strange, spiraling neumes near its binding. When decoded, they point to a network of underground root cellars used during pogroms. This wasn't just wayfinding, it was communal care set to music. The legacy persists in surprising ways. Modern ethnomusicologists have found that elderly women in remote regions often retain fragments of these melodies long after written versions vanish. In the Pyrenees, a shepherdess in her 90s recently led researchers to a forgotten shrine by singing a milking song whose intervals matched a 12th century manuscript's marginalia. Elsewhere, a Ukrainian babushka's embroidery pattern unlocked a Galician hymn's cryptic river-crossing symbols. These living archives remind us that history isn't just preserved in libraries, it's carried in the throats and hands of those written out of the official record. Yet for all their contributions, women's roles were systematically erased. Male chroniclers dismissed route-bearing hymns as domestic ditties, while Reformation-era bishops burned nun-scribed antiphoners as women's superstitions. Even today, museum labels rarely note the female scribes who repaired fragile notations or the abbesses who commissioned maps to protect vulnerable travelers. Rediscovering these stories does more than correct the historical record. It reveals a clandestine sisterhood of cartographers who understood that survival, like music, requires listening closely to voices the world tries to silence. The secrets of medieval hymn maps don't reveal themselves easily. Centuries of fading ink, parchment wear, and even deliberate erasures have left many clues nearly invisible to the naked eye. But modern science is changing that. Advanced imaging techniques like multispectral analysis and X-ray fluorescence are peeling back the layers of time, exposing hidden annotations and faded markings that scribes never intended for prying eyes. Take the case of a 13th century antiphona from Chartres Cathedral. Under normal light, its pages appear pristine, just neat rows of musical notation. But when researchers at the British Library subjected it to multispectral imaging, the parchment lit up with a spiderweb of faint lines and symbols. What emerged was a stunningly accurate map of pilgrimage routes through the Loire Valley, its rivers and safe houses marked in ink now visible only under specific wavelengths. The magic lies in the chemistry of medieval inks. Iron gall ink, the standard for scribes, darkens over time as its iron compounds oxidize, but traces remain embedded in the parchment fibers long after the visible marks fade. Hyperspectral cameras can detect these chemical ghosts by capturing light reflected at dozens of wavelengths, revealing differences in absorption that human eyes can't perceive. Even more startling are the discoveries made with X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy (XRF), which identifies elemental compositions. A team at Stanford recently used XRF to spot traces of zinc in a Swiss choirbook, an element found in certain alpine spring waters. The zinc-rich notes formed a perfect trail to healing hot springs mentioned in local legends but lost to modern maps. Some of the most exciting breakthroughs come from reflectance transformation imaging (RTI), a technique that photographs manuscripts under varying angles of light. When applied to a Hungarian hymn book, RTI revealed subtle indentations where scribes had pressed their quills extra hard to mark river crossings. These grooves, invisible under flat lighting, became clear as topographic contours when viewed with algorithmic enhancement. The same method uncovered palimpsest maps, routes scratched into parchment beneath layers of newer text, like medieval versions of a sketchpad erased and reused. One such find in a Spanish monastery showed a maze of tunnels beneath Santiago de Compostela, their entrances coded into the flourishes of a hymn to Saint James. But the real game changer is terahertz imaging, which penetrates layers of parchment like a musical MRI. In Austria, this technology detected the shadowy remains of a charcoal underdrawing beneath a 15th century gradual, a rough sketch of the Brenner Pass that the scribe had used as a guide before inking the final musical notation. The discovery proved these maps weren't accidental byproducts of composition, but deliberately planned cartographic works. Even erased passages aren't safe from modern tools. Chemical baths can sometimes resurrect ink that was scrubbed away centuries ago. A Vatican library conservator recently restored a route to a secret Franciscan hermitage by bathing a damaged page in a solution that reacted with residual iron particles, making the vanished ink temporarily reappear like a whisper from the past. What's emerging is a revolution in how we understand medieval scribble culture. Far from being haphazard, these hidden maps demonstrate meticulous precision. Spectral analysis of a Burgundian manuscript revealed that scribes used at least 3 ink recipes: standard black for music, diluted gray for minor landmarks, and an iron-rich blend that darkened over time to highlight critical dangers. Some even employed organic, invisible inks like lemon juice or milk, which yellow subtly with age but remain detectable through protein fluorescence imaging. The level of sophistication suggests these techniques were carefully taught in scriptoriums, passed down through generations of monk cartographers. Yet for all their power, these technologies raise new mysteries. Why does a cluster of notes in a Bohemian hymn emit unusual infrared signatures? What explains the copper traces found along the margin of a Welsh psalter, a metal seldom used in ink? Each answered question births a dozen more, proving that even our most advanced tools are just beginning to decode the full complexity of these musical maps. The parchment still holds secrets, waiting for the next leap in science to tease them free. One thing is certain: the medieval mind was far more inventive than we ever imagined, and its creations are only now stepping into the light. Legends of treasure maps hidden in hymns have fueled imaginations for centuries, whispering of forgotten gold, sacred relics, and royal jewels concealed beneath layers of musical notation. The myth persists for good reason. Medieval scribes did encode practical routes, so why not riches? But the truth is far more intriguing than fiction. While no verified treasure hymn has ever been found, the line between cartography and treasure hunting blurs when you consider how these maps safeguarded something far more valuable than gold: survival. Take the infamous case of the Salzburg Antiphona, a 15th century choir book rumored to chart a path to a lost Habsburg treasury. For decades, treasure hunters scrutinized its ornate initials, convinced the looping vines of a capital G concealed the location of a silver mine. Modern spectral imaging revealed the truth: the swirls did hide a map, but not for treasure. They marked a network of secret salt routes used to bypass oppressive taxes, a lifeline for struggling merchants. The real treasure was economic freedom disguised as sacred art. Other legends crumble under similar scrutiny. A Welsh psalter long tied to Arthurian lore supposedly contained a melody leading to the king's hoard. When scholars reconstructed the hymn, its notes traced an ancient cattle-driving path to highland pastures, critical knowledge for avoiding English tax collectors during rebellions. The hoard wasn't gold, it was sustenance and sovereignty. Even the Vatican's so-called treasure hymn of Clement V, allegedly guiding crusaders to Templar wealth, turned out to document safe houses for persecuted Jews in Provence. These weren't maps to loot but to liberation, yet the treasure myth isn't entirely baseless. Some hymns did point to valuables, just not the kind adventurers expect. A recently decoded Benedictine gradual from Burgundy uses sharp, angular neumes to mark the locations of rare medicinal springs, their mineral-rich waters more precious than coin to plague-stricken communities. Another from Tuscany encodes the whereabouts of master stonemasons' workshops, their skills worth more than ducats according to marginal notes. The riches were often practical: a midwife's herbal stash, a blacksmith's iron cache, or a scriptorium's vellum supply communal resources protected through song. The most compelling evidence against literal treasure maps lies in the economics of medieval cartography. Creating accurate maps required costly materials and rare expertise, making them too valuable to risk on mere speculation. Why would monks gamble their painstaking work on buried chests when they could aid tangible, immediate needs like trade or pilgrimage? The real alchemy of these hymns wasn't turning lead into gold. It was transforming ink and parchment into safety, connection, and resilience. That's not to say the legends lack purpose. The enduring fantasy of musical treasure maps reveals a deeper truth about how we view the past. In a world where survival often depended on coded knowledge, the ability to hide life-saving information in plain sight must have seemed like magic. Perhaps the greatest treasure these hymns offer isn't gold, but the rediscovery of a time when art and survival were inseparable, and a melody could mean the difference between life and death. The next frontier in uncovering these hidden musical maps lies at the intersection of artificial intelligence and centuries-old parchment. Imagine an algorithm trained to scan thousands of digitized manuscripts in minutes, detecting subtle patterns no human eye could spot. A slight curve in a musical staff here, an oddly spaced lyric there, that together reveal lost trade routes or forgotten pilgrimage paths. Projects like the Global Choirbook Initiative are doing just that, feeding medieval notation into machine learning systems that can predict with startling accuracy where undiscovered map hymns might be hiding. Early trials have already flagged over 200 previously overlooked manuscripts for closer study, including a Bavarian gradual where the AI noticed that certain notes consistently align with known Roman road markers when the page is held at a 30-degree angle. But technology isn't just helping us find these maps, it's teaching us to hear them as medieval travelers did. Cutting-edge audio spatialization software can now reconstruct how a hymn would have sounded in the very landscapes it mapped. Researchers at Cambridge recently paired a 13th-century melody with LiDAR scans of the Swiss Alps, creating a 3D soundscape where each note resonates differently depending on terrain, echoing off cliff faces where the path narrows, or fading into open valleys where the route branches. The effect is uncanny. Modern test subjects walking these routes while listening to the spatialized hymn instinctively adjusted their pace to match the music's warnings, proving these maps still work on some primal level. The real breakthroughs may come from crowdsourcing. Platforms like Choircart allow anyone to upload photos of suspicious manuscripts, where volunteers and algorithms collaborate to decode potential routes. A retired engineer in Portugal recently made headlines by discovering that smudges on a 15th-century antiphona weren't stains at all. They were microscopic pinholes marking a smuggling route through Catalonia, visible only when backlit. Meanwhile, citizen scientists are comparing folk melodies passed down orally with digitized hymn fragments, bridging gaps in the written record. In Norway, a fisherman's daughter recognized a lullaby her grandmother sang as a variant of a lost Cistercian hymn, a melody that, when mapped, traced a coastal path to a medieval herring market. Preservation tech races against time to save these fragile secrets. Hyperspectral imaging can now recover ink from crumbling pages too delicate to touch, while nanotechnology stabilizes parchment at the molecular level. The most exciting innovation, CRISPR-based bioink that uses modified yeast to reinforce faded pigments without altering their chemical signatures. At the Vatican Library, this technique recently resurrected a vanished route to a Franciscan hermitage, its directions hidden in lemon juice ink that had yellowed into invisibility over 6 centuries. Yet some of the most promising research looks beyond Europe. Scholars are investigating whether similar systems existed in Byzantine chant, Armenian charakans, or even pre-Columbian Mesoamerican hymns. A recent study of Ethiopian mesmer music found striking parallels. Certain melodic intervals correspond to mountain passes on the historic salt road to Lalibela. Could this be evidence of a global tradition of sonic cartography? The answer may lie in cross-cultural collaborations now underway between musicologists, historians, and indigenous knowledge keepers from the Andes to the Himalayas. What keeps researchers awake at night isn't just what they might find, it's what could still be lost. Climate change threatens manuscripts in tropical monasteries with mold, while political instability endangers archives from Timbuktu to Mosul. The race isn't just for discovery, it's for salvation. Every decoded hymn is a thread pulled from oblivion, rewoven into the fabric of human memory. And as these technologies evolve, one thing becomes clear. We've only just begun to hear what the past has been trying to tell us. The hidden maps woven into medieval choir hymns stand as one of history's most extraordinary acts of quiet rebellion, proof that even in an era of war and division, human creativity refused to be silenced. These melodies did more than guide travelers. They preserved knowledge across generations, turning something as fragile as parchment and ink into an unbreakable chain of survival. What's astonishing isn't just the ingenuity of encoding geography into music, but the sheer audacity of hiding it in the one place no warlord would think to look: the sacred songs of the church. Consider the legacy these maps left behind. Modern highways in Switzerland still follow paths first charted by monks' quills, their curves mirroring the rise and fall of long-forgotten melodies. The rhythmic patterns of alpine herding calls echo the staccato warnings of avalanche zones from 12th century antiphoners. Even our language carries traces of this secret cartography. Phrases like "reading between the lines" or "following the tune" take on new meaning when you realize they might stem from an era when every note held directions. The past didn't just leave us artifacts, it left us a way of seeing the world where art and survival were inseparable. Rediscovering these hymns challenges how we view the Middle Ages. Far from a dark age of isolation, this was a time when ordinary people, merchants humming under their breath, scribes trading coded choir books, minstrels carrying routes in their songs, stitched together a hidden network of connection beneath the chaos of kings and crusades. That's the real revelation. History isn't just written in treaties and battles, but in the quiet persistence of those who refused to let the world be divided. As technology peels back layers of these manuscripts, we're not just uncovering old routes, we're reclaiming a mindset. In an age of satellites and GPS, there's something profoundly human about maps you could carry in your memory, about landscapes you learned through song. These hymns remind us that the most powerful tools aren't always the loudest or most obvious. Sometimes they're the ones disguised as something too ordinary to notice, until the moment you need them most. So the next time you hear a piece of medieval music, listen closely. Beneath the harmonies, you might just catch the whisper of footsteps on an old pilgrim road, or the echo of a merchant's sigh as he spots the safe house marked by a recurring refrain. The maps may have faded, but the music remembers, and if this journey through hidden histories has sparked your curiosity, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts below, pass the story along, and who knows, You might be the one to hum a long-lost melody that leads us to the next great discovery. The past is still singing. All we have to do